If you look at Poland now, it's hard to imagine how far its pilots once had to fly just to keep fighting. When World War II tore their country apart, Polish airmen didn't disappear. They scattered. Britain, France, the Soviet Union. Wherever aircraft were available, they climbed in and kept going. These weren't pilots protected by borders. They were exiles, carrying loss into every cockpit, turning borrowed machines into weapons. Some of the deadliest aircraft of the war were flown by men who no longer had a home to land in. And in today's video, we're walking through every Polish deadliest aircraft used in World War II and the stories behind how they were flown. ZSL P-11. Over. Imagine this for a second. Before exile, before borrowed uniforms and foreign runways, Polish pilots were climbing into an aircraft built at home. The PZL P-11 came out of Poland in the early 1930s, designed by Państwowe Zakłady Lotnicze, wearing that distinctive gull wing that opened up visibility in ways most fighters couldn't touch. Its all-metal construction was cutting edge when it arrived, a symbol of a young air force trying to keep pace with a dangerous world. By 1939, though, the world had already outrun it. German fighters were faster, heavier armed, and built for a different kind of war. Still, when September came, P-11s didn't hide. They rose into German formations anyway, knowing the odds, feeling the difference in speed and firepower, and fighting regardless. Many of the men who survived those desperate flights later fled Poland, carrying that brutal first experience into France and then Britain, where they transitioned into Allied aircraft. Long after the P-11 vanished from front lines, its legacy traveled with them. It was the cockpit that hardened young pilots, shaping some of the war's fiercest Polish aces under conditions no training program could ever recreate. PZL 37. Wash something is haunting about how close the Wash came to greatness. Built just before the war, this twin-engine Polish medium bomber was considered advanced for its time, especially for its aerodynamics and the heavy bomb load it could carry. On paper, it represented ambition. In reality, it entered combat outnumbered and unfinished. By September 1939, only a few dozen were operational, which meant the crews who flew them were sent on missions that felt disturbingly close to suicide. They pushed into Luftwaffe-dominated skies anyway, threading flak, chasing targets, and releasing bombs while German fighters hunted them almost freely. After Poland's collapse, several Wash crews escaped through neutral countries, carrying more than memories. They carried experience in formation flying and precision bombing that later fed into Allied strike tactics. What lingers around the Wash isn't just performance data, but mood. Heavy payloads, thin chances, and airmen who understood they were outmatched yet still turned toward defended targets. Hawker Hurricane Mark I. Now let's jump to Britain, where accents were foreign and uniforms borrowed, but the skies were suddenly familiar territory again. Polish pilots didn't waste time blending in. They formed squadrons, most famously No. 303, and climbed into Hawker Hurricanes just as the Battle of Britain began to choke the island. The Hurricane didn't carry the glamour of the Spitfire, but it was rugged, dependable, and it became the backbone of early defense when everything still hung in the balance. No. 303, largely Polish, tore into Luftwaffe formations with an intensity that shocked even the RAF, racking up one of the highest kill ratios of the entire battle. These weren't cautious sorties. These were personal. Many of these pilots had already watched their country fall and their squadrons die. Every Hurricane takeoff carried more than fuel and ammunition. It carried a loss. In those months over Britain, hurricanes became instruments of survival and vengeance at once. Supermarine Spitfire. Mark 5B. By 1941 and 1942, the war in the air was changing again, and Polish squadrons changed with it. Hurricanes gave way to Spitfires, and with them came new roles: high-altitude interception, bomber escort, deeper penetration into contested skies. The Spitfire Mark 5B, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin, was nimble, responsive, and built for tight, punishing dogfights. Pilots such as WWII flew this variant, carving through the air in machines that finally felt equal to what Germany sent against them. The psychological shift mattered. For the first time since 1939, Polish aviators weren't simply enduring. They were matching fear with fear. Spitfires allowed them to climb higher, strike harder, and stay longer. They also restored something quieter, but just as powerful: confidence. When a Polish pilot rolled a Mark 5B into a turn, he did it knowing the aircraft beneath him was as feared by the Luftwaffe as any German fighter. That knowledge changed the way they fought. It changed the way they breathed in the cockpit. North American Mustang Mark III. All right, by 1944, the war had opened outward, and so had the reach of Polish pilots. Squadrons like No. 315, City of Damblin, converted to North American Mustang Mark IIIs, and the change was immediate. Range, speed, endurance. The Mustang gave them the ability to escort bombers deep into occupied Europe, to stay with them, to fight their way there and back. Earlier, RAF fighters couldn't always promise that. These could. With Mustangs, Polish pilots weren't limited to defending skies. They crossed them. They outpaced interceptors, tangled with enemy fighters far from the coast, and guarded heavy bombers on strikes aimed straight at the infrastructure of the Reich. The aircraft itself symbolized a turning point. Exiled airmen were no longer only reacting to German pressure. They were projecting their own. Every long-range mission carried them closer to the lands taken from them, closer to the factories and railways feeding the war that had destroyed their homes. Moran Saulnier. MS 406. Let me walk you into this one, the way it actually felt. Poland was gone. Airfields were gone. Squadrons were shattered. And suddenly, French soil was where Polish pilots were waking up. After 1939, many of them escaped west and were absorbed into French units almost immediately, just in time for the Battle of France. The aircraft waiting for them was the Moran Saulnier, MS 406. It wasn't a machine anyone would choose. Against the German Bf 109, it lacked speed, power, and bite. But there was no luxury of comparison. It flew, so they flew it. These fighters were thrown into desperate defensive battles, climbing to meet formations that already controlled the air. And still, the Polish pilots scored victories in the MS 406, forcing results out of an aircraft that offered very little help. Those kills didn't come from the machine. They came from instinct and refusal. The campaign ended quickly and brutally, almost as soon as it began. And that's exactly why the MS 406 matters. Borrowed aircraft, borrowed bases, fresh grief, and pilots still taking off because stopping simply wasn't part of their vocabulary. The Vickers Wellington. Here's where the war for Polish airmen stopped being fast and started being endless. When the Wellington entered their story, daylight battles gave way to night corridors, frozen oxygen masks, and engines droning for hours. This twin-engine medium bomber carried a distinctive geodetic airframe, a woven internal structure that made it unusually tough when flak began tearing through the sky. From late 1940 through 1943, Polish squadrons, especially No. 300 Masovia and No. the 301 Pomeranian, flew Wellingtons from British bases scattered across Lincolnshire and beyond. On the ground, exile crews worked through the dark, keeping damaged aircraft alive because every repaired Wellington meant another strike at the forces occupying their homeland. In the air, those bombers hauled loads approaching 4,000 pounds toward Berlin, the Ruhr, and fortified coastal targets. Missions were long. Cabins were bitterly cold. Attrition was always waiting. Crews took off, knowing each flight might be their last. Avro Lancaster. This aircraft arrived when Polish bombing stopped being a struggle and became a statement. 4 Merlin engines pulled these machines into deep Germany, carrying bomb loads that earlier aircraft could never have lifted. Polish crews flew Lancasters against industrial heartlands, V-weapon facilities, and late war targets, including missions aimed at Berchtesgaden. But the Lancaster story isn't just in tonnage. It lived inside the fuselage, fingers numbed by altitude, gripping controls. Flak bursts close enough to feel like an impact. Letters from occupied Poland were folded into jackets that would never return home. By early 1944, No. 300 Squadron transitioned to the Avro Lancaster Mark I and Mark III, stepping into the flagship heavy bomber of RAF Bomber Command. The Lancaster spread dread across the Reich, night after night. Yet for Polish aviators, it carried something else as well, a twisted form of hope. Hawker Typhoon. Let me put it this way. When the Typhoon showed up, subtlety left the runway. This aircraft was built for low altitude, for violent close to the ground, and for the kind of power that shook airframes before it shook enemies. Later in the war, Polish pilots flew as part of larger RAF formations operating Hawker Typhoons, stepping into a machine driven by the roaring Napier Sabre engine and shaped for bomber escort, where interception, and especially ground attack. From mid-1944 onward, Polish airmen flying within these wings struck armor, convoys, and battlefield positions across Normandy and deeper into occupied Europe. The Typhoon wasn't about finesse. It was about tearing open whatever stood in front of advancing armies. For pilots who had spent years fighting far from home, these missions carried a different weight. Every low-level run carried them over soil that looked closer to the one they'd lost. Handley Page, Halifax. No one ever described Halifax as beautiful, and that was almost the point. This 4-engine heavy bomber earned its place by surviving punishment. From 1943 onward, No. 301 Squadron flew Halifaxes alongside Wellingtons and Liberators, pushing Polish crews into the most punishing phase of the bomber war. These aircraft hammered Ruhr industrial targets and later took on special duty work across the Mediterranean, stretching Polish airmen across distant fronts they never imagined flying over. Halifax missions stacked the odds high. Long routes, dense flak belts, repeated night penetrations that erased whole crews between briefings. Many Halifaxes returned carrying scars from earlier raids, patched, dented, and sent back again. The men inside them weren't untouched either. Polish crews fought enemy fire, but they also fought exhaustion and the quiet weight of exile. Every Halifax that rolled onto a runway carried history in its skin, proof that survival itself had become part of the mission. Consolidated Liberator. This one didn't announce itself with noise. It arrived with distance. The Consolidated Liberator became a tool of reach when No. 301's role shifted toward long-range bombing and special operations, particularly from bases connected to the Italian theater. Its greatest weapon wasn't speed or armor. It was how far it could go. Liberators carried Polish crews deep into enemy territory, then deeper still, operating as bombers, transports, and covert platforms. Inside them traveled bombs, reconnaissance teams, resistance supplies, sometimes all on the same aircraft. Polish aviators landed on improvised strips hidden behind enemy lines, trusting maps that were often little more than hope. These missions rarely made headlines. They unfolded under moonlight, in silence, in routes whispered about more than recorded. Many weren't officially acknowledged until decades later. And that's why the Liberator matters. De Havilland Mosquito. You know that feeling when something looks wrong for the job, then turns out to be perfect? That was the Mosquito. Built from wood, light on armor, and almost fragile by appearance, it earned the nickname the Wooden Wonder for a reason. Late in the war, Polish crews found themselves flying this twin-engine machine inside specialized RAF squadrons like No. 305, on taking part in strike and night operations that demanded precision more than brute force. The Mosquito didn't bully its way into defended airspace. It slipped in. Its speed and altitude performance allowed it to cut through guarded corridors, hit carefully chosen targets, and vanish before fighters could organize a response. That blistering pace came at a cost. Minimal protection meant nerves had to replace armor. For Polish exiles, being assigned to Mosquito operations meant entering an elite circle where mistakes were rarely tolerated. These missions often aimed at rail hubs or Gestapo headquarters, places where a single accurate strike could save lives on the ground. Ferry battle. If I tell you honestly, nobody felt powerful climbing into a ferry battle. This single-engine light bomber entered the Polish story in Britain during 1940, when exiled squadrons were still being formed, and operational readiness mattered more than prestige. The aircraft itself was slow, underpowered, and brutally vulnerable to both fighters and flak. And yet, it flew. Polish crews used it to relearn combat routines, navigation, formation discipline, and the physical grind of operational flight. The battle didn't stay long on the front lines. It couldn't. Losses came quickly, and the type was phased out as heavier aircraft became available. But its importance sits somewhere else. Like flying battles dragged Polish airmen back into the rhythm of war after the shock of collapse and escape. It echoed the desperate early days when aircraft were whatever could be found, not what was wanted. That short, grim chapter marked a transition point. From scattered survivors flying obsolete machines into a reorganized force that would soon operate some of the most formidable bombers in the Allied arsenal. Polikarpov PO-2. If you lined it up next to late war fighters, you'd almost laugh. The PO-2 looked like it belonged in a museum before the war even started. Wooden frame, fabric skin, an engine that sounded more like a lawn tool than a weapon. And yet, for Polish pilots serving with units reformed in the Soviet sphere, this Soviet-designed biplane became a working aircraft of war. Its very weakness shaped its role. Slow and light, it could drift through the night where faster machines failed. Flak crews overshot it. Fighters struggled to line up on it. That made it ideal for reconnaissance, close support tasks, supply drops, and harassment flights over contested ground. Polish crews flew PO-2s again and again into enemy zones, gathering intelligence, spotting artillery, and even carrying out light bombing runs. It wasn't impressive. It was useful. And sometimes usefulness is deadlier than power. The contrast between its humble appearance and the seriousness of its missions captures one of the harsher truths of exile. A Supermarine Spitfire. Mark 9. There's a moment in every long war when survival quietly turns into control. For many Polish squadrons, that moment came with the Spitfire Mark 9. By the heart of the European air war, units like No. 315, City of Damblin, had transitioned into this variant, a fighter that finally balanced speed, firepower, and altitude performance in a way that matched what Germany could field. Polish pilots flew Mark 9s on escort missions, interceptions, and aggressive sweeps over France and the Low Countries. These weren't defensive flights. These were pressure flights. They tangled with Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, pushing forward into airspace that once belonged entirely to the enemy. The aircraft itself became more than a tool. It became a symbol. After years of retreat, rebuilding, and borrowed cockpits, the Spitfire Mark 9 represented recovery. So, that's all for today. Hope you found this video informative. Then show your love by pushing the like and subscribe buttons. Thanks for watching. We will see you at the next one.